Tonight, Professor Bruce will be with us. She's currently an associate professor at the Institute of the Academic Medicine at Houston Methodist and an adjunct associate professor at the Texas A&M Health Science Center. Professor Bruce has taught over 3,000 medical students and residents, nurses, and other allied healthcare professionals. She has developed and/or sustained at least 15 ethics committees for various hospitals and has served as an ethics consultant to several others. And we will also have Jacob Coleman, and he's a senior scientific writer at Houston Methodist with over 10 years of research experience, including a study on professional, industrial, and regulatory standards related to the ethics and science of research involving human subjects. Today, we will complement our module number 3, Planning Patient-Centered Consent and Study Protocols.
Jacob and I are really excited to teach this subject and to talk with you all about it. We really want to hear from you. We hope you have your phones with you because we're actually going to be polling you all at some point, only because we recognize that some people might be a little less comfortable talking, and sometimes when you're polling a group, you can get a better feel of the different range of opinions and perspectives, and you can kind of get a sense of where there might be consensus and where there isn't consensus. So we really like to poll just to really kind of encourage engagement and to hear from you all and try to create some discussion. So if you've got a cell phone on you, that's fantastic. It's very easy to navigate. Trust me, I'm not very technically inclined, and yet even I can do this polling program. So we're gonna turn to that in just a bit. But this is a subject we both feel very passionate about. For Jacob, he comes very much at it from the research ethics lens. I don't think I have ever met anybody as strong with writing protocols and consents, and we're going to go into what that means in just a minute. I look at it a little bit more from the patient experience lens and the ethics behind it. So you heard about my academic interest, but I'm also system director of patient experience. So I very much come at it from patient perspectives and less of a lens on the research side. So we thought that by having both of us together, somebody who comes at it very much from a research ethics perspective and somebody else who comes at it from a little bit more of a patient experience or patient ethics perspective, you'd really get a really rich perspective. That's our goal today. Jacob, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that. I hope I set us up fairly. You did us justice.
That just about covers it. Thanks.
All right, so this gives you some sense of where we're headed today. We are going to start with a little bit of history because we really think the foundation here is pretty important for why there's so much of a focus on research ethics. We did a lot of wrong from an America standpoint, from a government standpoint, from a regulatory standpoint. There was a lot of years of really just some not good stuff in our history, and I think knowing that is really important to set the foundation for why we're where we're at. We're going to talk about some key definitions and concepts that relates to ethical research. So you'll hear me use the term consent. You'll hear me use the term protocol. We're going to talk a little bit more about what that means in just a minute. And we're going to have quite a lot of emphasis on ethical considerations. So you're stuck with me and Jacob, both of whom really come at it from ethics. So we're going to spend some time on that, but we'll also cover safety and other research components too. And we're going to use a lot of case studies because we want to hear from you guys. All right, so what does history tell us? We haven't always had a very bright light. I'd love to be able to say we've always done right as a country, but I don't think that's really surprising for you to hear that we haven't. Tuskegee, by a show of hands, how many people have heard of the Tuskegee experiments? Okay, not a good time in history. Just briefly, the Tuskegee Institute and the Alabama Public Health Department decided to join together in a project in the early 1930s. This is a real picture. And what they were studying was the evolution or the history of syphilis. They wanted to watch it through its course of illness through people. They started in the 1930s. they recruited 400 Black men who had syphilis and 200 Black men who did not have syphilis. Now, importantly, they didn't actually tell them what the nature of the project was. So they said, well, we're going to be doing these injections, and we are basically going to be treating you for what they called bad blood, which was just a local term. It was used to refer to any sort of fatigue or tiredness, just sort of a general term for illness. So they had no consent. They didn't really tell them what the nature of the project was about. They weren't treating them really for anything. And those shots weren't really doing anything. Importantly, they did pay them. They did give them some health insurance coverage, some food meals. I think we can argue that maybe there was a little bit of exploitation there. These were farm workers, generally on the lower end of the socioeconomic scale. They didn't have a lot of money to work with, and we were paying them. We were at least paying them in the way of resources, additional resources. Importantly, in the 1940s, syphilis could be effectively treated. The standard of care became penicillin in the 1940s. They didn't tell them, hey, by the way, there's a treatment available for you that's standard of care. Did not tell them. They kept running the experiment all the way through. And then in the 1970s, the only reason why it came to light was because the press got a hold of it and said, hey, there wasn't really any consent here. You didn't treat these folks. You didn't tell them about the availability of penicillin. You were actively pretending like you were treating them with these injections, but you weren't really doing anything. And you let the syphilis course really run rampant for these participants. And when they caught a hold of it, after the press ran with it, there was a full investigation. And what they said was, look, this was really, really not good. You guys let this, whatever benefit you got, and which was very little benefit, any benefit from watching this disease progression, that benefit was far outweighed by the risks of non-treatment to these folks who had syphilis. You knew about penicillin and its availability, and you didn't offer it. So the risk far outweighed the benefit. Then we have Henrietta Lacks. Big important person in history. She didn't even mean to become important in history. She was she kept having these stomach pains, and she was going into different doctors, and they weren't really able to diagnose it, and they finally found what they thought was cervical cancer. And so when they were biopsying the tumor, they removed some of her cancer cells, sent it to a researcher. I think it was Johns Hopkins, if I remember correctly, sent it to a researcher, and he basically learned something very interesting about her cells, which is that they reproduced at a really quick rate and they didn't die very quickly. He's like, geez, these are really fascinating cells. And he basically reproduced those to become what's called a very famous cell line, the HeLa cell line, which was known for curing, or it was responsible at least, behind the research that cured polio vaccines, I think, came from that line. And a lot of cancer research came from that cell line. Her cell line all came from there. AIDS research really stemmed from her work, or from her cell line. She didn't know anything about it, and that was standard at the time. People felt like cells are no longer part of your body. They're not your property, so you no longer own them. So your consent or permission is not needed. There was a lot of commercialization made off of her cell lines, a lot of research, a lot of money, and none of it came back to her. Now, there's a lot of attempts to try to fix that way after the fact, but she was done wrong, and her family was done wrong. So while the emphasis has typically been on either vulnerable populations or minorities or people that just don't necessarily have the resources or mechanisms to advocate for themselves, there have been some research ethics violations on even just white, affluent college kids. Far less impacting them, but there have been. And Jesse Gelsinger, right there up in the top left, is an example. I think he had a liver genetic disorder. He had a mild form of it. So normally it's very fatal. but it wasn't fatal for him because he had a mild form. So he's like, I really want to help the babies. In fact, that was the statement he'd always say. I am doing this for the babies. So he decided, well, I'm going to participate in this research study where they're going to learn a lot about how fatal this disease is and how to treat it. So they injected him with a virus. He ended up dying 4 days later. And that was I think it was the University of Pennsylvania or somebody really big. And he ultimately died. And when they were we're trying to unpack what went wrong in this research project, what they learned is, first of all, he didn't even meet inclusion criteria. He had really high, I think it was something his blood count was really high. He should have not even been included in the participation in the project. But one patient or one participant dropped out of the research. They needed somebody, they put him in there, even though he didn't meet criteria, and he died. And he died because of this injection, by the way. He had a terrible immuno response to it, and ultimately had sepsis, died. And the argument they've said is there was just a lot of risks in this project, and you didn't tell him. You shouldn't have even done the project. There was reason from previous research done on monkeys that there was a pretty high mortality rate from these injections, and yet you didn't tell us any of this, and you were conducting human research, and you were doing it on teens and not telling them of the risks, and they ultimately die because of your injection. I mean, he was a healthy individual for the most part, other than this genetic disorder. They also found some other things that could have been done better. Apparently 2 or 3 participants had some pretty bad reactions. So these are some of the kind of cornerstones of history. When you think of research ethics, think of these cases. And stemming largely from the Tuskegee experiment, we came out with the Belmont report. Belmont is pretty foundational to research ethics, and it established 3 core ethical principles. And it basically said, look, we got to apologize for his done really wrong here. We need to respect participants, respect the person in front of us, and try to protect their autonomy of all people. Can anyone tell me what they think of when they hear the word autonomy? What do you think of?
Being independent.
Very good. Privacy, independence, who we are as individuals, giving us weight to ourselves and our own choices and our own decisions. We have to respect the choice of that participant. And the only way we can respect that participant's choice is if we give them a lot of information, which is sometimes called consent, giving them enough information to make an informed decision to give permission to participate in the research. Beneficence is another major core ethical principle. It basically says you need to make sure that those benefits of your research far outweigh any risk or harm. Benefits must outweigh. Remember, all this language from these studies focused on the risks and benefits. It said here the benefits were outweighed by the harms. You need to make sure when doing research the benefits far outweigh the harms. Justice means you need to do right by people. You need to make sure that you are fair, and you need to make sure you're thorough, and you need to make sure you're not exploiting anyone, and you certainly aren't focusing on vulnerable populations just because they're easier to work with in any capacity. So those 3 core ethical principles are then pulled out and looked at in 3 different ways, 3 different applications: consent, risks and benefits research, and selecting subjects. And that's what we're going to discuss next. So we just wanted to make a quick difference, a distinction between 2 different terms. When we refer to practice or medicine or patients, we're referring to doing right by that particular patient to help them. My focus is on this individual person. Is it okay for me to help you? Research actually has a very different aim. Research is focused on testing a hypothesis to create generalizable knowledge. It's less about the person in front of you and more about contributing to the body of research. So there's 2 differences here. There's practice and there's research. Practice and kind of medicine, clinical focus, the hospital experience. When you've completed a consent form for your surgeries, that's what we're referring to. The treating physician, the care team, the patient, the treatment consent. Is it okay for me as a physician to perform this particular procedure on your foot? Very different than when we're looking at it from a research lens. From a research lens, we're thinking about it as the research team or the investigator. The patient is not the term we use. The term we use for the person who's participating in the work is a participant or a subject. We prefer participant. Different language there. We have a research protocol, and we're going to show you what an example protocol looks like, and a consent. That has a slightly different name. And I think this is where you take over, Jacob.
Sure. So ethical considerations apply to every stage of the research, especially to the design stage, because they're all planned out in advance at the design stage, and that's when the study protocol is drafted. Design encompasses the study conduct and even actions to be done months or years after the study completion, like how to handle sensitive records. IRBs, or institutional review boards, that are independent bodies charged with reviewing and approving researchers' protocols, very rarely just unconditionally accept or reject a study. More often, they ask questions, they approve with modifications, or sometimes table a protocol until an important issue can be clarified by the researcher. So the design is initially drafted, it's submitted to the institutional review board, but then it can be revised in light of that review board's feedback. And the review board is a diverse body. It is supposed to be composed of men, women, scientists, non-scientists, people who are part of the institution, volunteers who are outside of the institution. This quota has to be met in order for an institutional review board to have the perspectives necessary to really review a researcher's plan so that perspectives are not overlooked from the broader community. Then a study truly begins, or sometimes we say it launches or initiates, when the first potential subject answers to recruitment efforts and is screened in for inclusion. And during study conduct, adherence to the protocol is very important. If there are any modifications to the protocol, those are sent to the IRB first for approval. If there are any deviations from the protocol, that is reported to the IRB as well. So there is an oversight process throughout the entire study life. And even some regular reporting, absent any modifications or deviations, researchers are expected to regularly report to the IRB and also to study sponsors on usually an annual basis at least. And for especially risky studies, a safety monitoring board by independent safety monitors may also be required to see, is the study still safe given the data that we've received? Should it be stopped? And should it be stopped because it's unsafe, or should it be stopped because we in fact found the answer faster than we thought we would find the answer? Because once you find the answer to your research question, there's no reason to continue imposing upon the subjects. So if new developments emerge during this course of the study, or the study changes in a way that might imply a different set of risks to the subjects, the consent is also updated. You can see that this process is in stark contrast to what happened in studies like Tuskegee, where there were developments outside of the study, right? Penicillin became available. That should have been made known to the subjects. So now there are processes in place to ensure that in the middle of a study, those documents and consents are updated. And then, as I said, after the study, the principal investigator maintains the data and the records in a secure and protected manner until it would be acceptable to securely destroy older records. Next slide.
So this is where we're hoping to hear from you all. So, and by no means do you need to memorize all these steps. All we really wanted to illustrate here is it's a pretty complex process. Not only do you design something, you then got to have approval. You have to really think through the risks and benefits, and you need to make sure that when you actually conduct the research, it is really ethically justified, and that you're watching their safety, and that you will stop the project if it becomes too unsafe, and that you will always amend and keep them updated if new information like the availability of penicillin becomes well known. All right, so if you've got your phone, you can, this is a QR code, so you can use the camera to zero in on the QR code. Or if you're less comfortable working with QR codes, you can go to this website, menti.com, and enter that code. And when you open this up, it's going to bring you to something that's called Menti, and it will have instructions, and it have a little heart. So if you see the words instructions with a little heart, that means you're in the right place. Have any of you ever read a consent? Like, it could be in the medical setting, you were getting surgery for your foot, or you were going in to get a test done, or maybe you participated in research, and so you've had the benefit of reading a consent. Would you mind typing in what your first thoughts were when you read the consent, and what we should see after you type your impression of the consent is we'll see a word cloud, and that'll give us a good sense of what the group thinks of when they think of a consent. Why? Very good. Why am I having to do this? Surprise, signing life away. Gosh, it feels like I'm in with an attorney. Scary, a lot of medical language used, very official, a lot of HIPAA language. You see the word HIPAA all over the place. Feels overwhelming. It's often very long. A lot of disclaimers, very wordy. Too many words, very legalistic. Very good, guys. Why does this need to be so complex? Why is it so big? Why is it so scary? Yeah, that's exactly what we expected. And you can see the word scary and permission seems to be pretty overwhelming, confusing. I love this. Thanks, guys. You're getting really too long, too technical. Yep, for sure. Yeah, that has been a struggle, honestly, for many years. So what makes a consent valid, and why is it so long? Well, there are three components, whether it's a medical consent or a research consent. Either one, we expect for these three things to happen. One is we have to give you enough information for you to know the risks and benefits. So when you're going in for a medical surgery, you need to know what is the risk to me if I don't do this surgery? What is the risk to me if I do this? What are the benefits? What should I see in my recovery? What should I not see? Similarly, in the research setting, you need to know, well, I mean, I do want to benefit society, but I need, and I want to be able to create knowledge for the world, but is there any risk to me personally? What am I going to lose if I participate? Time, probably. Is there any safety risk to me? What am I going to get from it? What's the baby's going to get? Getting back to Jesse Gelsinger. We need to have information. And we used to just throw information at patients and participants and expected them to just be able to comprehend it all. And those of us like myself who study communication and decision making, what we've learned is that is just overwhelming. We got to take it back a notch. So there's this kind of regulatory legal framework that says you need all this stuff in there. And then there's those of us who study communication and we're like, but this is too much. We need to scale it back. So there's this tension between the legal elements and those of us who work with you all. Comprehension, you have to understand the information given. And then that's where I think we really struggle. We have to give so much information that I sometimes worry it's overwhelming. I know it's overwhelming. So we try to put it in very layman language. It's supposed to be comfortable for people with an 8th grade language or less. I don't think we do a good job of that. That's what we strive to do. And then the third element, which is a really important component that's often missed, is voluntariness, which means that the person has to feel free to participate in the research, and they have to be able to withdraw from the research at any time. Can anyone tell me, and you can put in the chat if you're more comfortable, can anyone tell me why voluntariness might be undermined? So what could we do in research that might make it less voluntary for someone to participate? And I said it when we were talking about Tuskegee. I said they paid them. Why might that impact voluntariness?
Would make people do it without asking questions if they're given something in return.
Very
Especially
good.
if it's something they can need or can't afford or.
Very good. Anybody else? Doesn't always have to be financial, by the way. What if I'm your boss and I give you this research consent form and I say, I really want you to participate in this study project looking at mentoring and the effectiveness of mentors as bosses. How might that make it less voluntary for you as a participant in the research?
Because he's asking for you to evaluate him, basically.
Yeah, and most of us try to please our bosses, right? And so we'll feel that power imbalance. We'll feel like we have to please this person, and then we won't feel free to participate in it. So we have to be really careful when we're looking at voluntariness to try to avoid any sort of money incentive that's going to really exploit, get people to do something they might not otherwise do. Any sort of power imbalance is going to create a problem. If your doctor is also serving as the investigator of a project, and we do see that a lot, cancer researchers, they work as physicians often, but they also are researchers. That can put patients in a little bit of an uncomfortable position. They want to please their physician by participating in the research. At the same time, they're wondering whether their care is going to be affected if they don't participate in the research. So these are all the tensions we have to try to work through. There are some ways to protect people's voluntariness. Got to give them time to consider. You have to make it very clear that their care is not going to be impacted in any way, whether they participate or not. If you're a clinician, a physician, or a nurse, you got to give always, they should be able to withdraw at any time with no harm. And you got to make sure that there's no threat. And I don't mean threat in a really verbal way. I mean, even an implied threat, like you're going to withhold something from someone or possibly withhold something. Those are the ways we can impact voluntariness. Now, for information, the information we like to see in the consent is the purpose of the, you got to come out of the gate telling them what are they doing in this project. Why are we doing this project? What is it that we hope to gain from it? Why would they need to be participating? What's the goal of the research? Because if they can't tell that right off the bat, they shouldn't be wanting to participate. Definitely got to put a lot of emphasis on the risks and benefits. Have to tell them all the steps that are involved. So we see how the information gets to be really long here, because we hope to see all these steps. But that means that sometimes the consent can get too long. We got to tell them how we're going to protect their information and their confidentiality, whether they'll be paid, if anything. What happens if they don't participate? So treatment alternatives, in the Tuskegee one, they needed to know about penicillin. That was a treatment alternative that was standard of care. The fact that they didn't know that was a problem. You need, these are all the different elements we have to spell out in the consent for information. And for comprehension, you got to make sure it's in layman language. You need to make sure that it's available in lots of different language, and they have to have the time to read it. This is not reading something. Fine. They have to truly digest the material. Some research participants actually say, I'm not going to have you sign this now. We'll wait some time. I'll see you in the next visit, hoping that the person will read. All right, getting back to Mentee, we hope you still have your phone open. Again, you can get at it either way. You can use the QR code, or if you're already open, you should you don't need to open it again if you're already there. So if you closed it accidentally, you can use the QR code again, or you can go to this website and enter the code. And the question here, which of the following is not true about HIPAA? Oh no, yeah, we did this on purpose. We wanted to see whether you've got any background knowledge on HIPAA. You've seen the word HIPAA all over the place, all over consent. Can you tell me just by guess, you don't need to get it right, which of the following is not true about HIPAA?
Courtney, since not everyone can get into Mentee, I'm seeing in the comments, can you also share the part of your screen that shows the options so we can get some activity in chat?
Here are the options. Can you see it now?
Perfect.
Okay, very good. All of them are not true. You did a better job at this than most physicians, honestly. We do a lot of physician education, and there's a lot of misimpressions and myths about HIPAA. HIPAA was never intended to interrupt clinical care, and it was never intended to stop all research. It was intended to protect participants, but it wasn't designed to interrupt workflow. It is not true that you cannot fax or email or text. You can use all of those mechanisms. You certainly should call patients or participants by their name, but it's far worse to go out into a waiting room and say, hey, man in red shirt, rather than Mr. Gibson. Of course you can use their name. You can use their name even on public settings. You should try to minimize people seeing the information as much as possible, but the care team, whether it be a research team or a clinical care team in a hospital setting, certainly can see this information. And you should talk to families, loved ones, as long as the participant or patient has given permission to do so. So a lot of misimpressions, particularly in the hospital setting, about what HIPAA authorizes and it doesn't authorize. So now we're going to show you a little bit more about what HIPAA does ask for, both in the clinical setting and in the research setting. What they expect is that anything that is disclosed is absolutely necessary and effective. So I prefer to use a clinical example. I think Jacob will come in behind me and use a research example. But you know, if you're gossiping in the cafeteria about a patient, is that necessary or effective for good patient care? Clearly not. If you're instead talking about the treatment that the patient has to get, and you're talking to the oncologist about the treatment plan, clearly that's necessary and effective. HIPAA does not ask that we go into a closet to talk about a patient. It's just, now what they do expect is that we'll take a little bit of extra precaution if it's sensitive information. Maybe we don't talk in the nurse's station if it's involving some suicidal ideation. That's a more sensitive subject. You probably want to keep your voices down, and you probably want to go into a more private area to discuss the patient's care. It does say that the risks of breaching confidentiality should be proportional to the benefits, meaning if you're going to breach someone's confidentiality, it has to be because there's something to be gained by doing so, and that what's to be gained outweighs any sort of loss in confidentiality. See how we weigh a lot of the risks and benefits. Research and consent is all about risks and benefits. They also ask that we try to make sure that the communication practices are transparent. So you tell patients when the information needs to be available, who will be going to, under what circumstances, and you need to be able to give them this basically a list of who all you're going to be disclosing their information to. That's what HIPAA asks for. It asks for us to use good judgment and be kind to people and their privacy, respect for persons, and be good by them. Do you want to, Jacob, do you want to add in anything from the research? I came at it from a clinical example. Do you want to add in a research example, or is that?
Yeah, so in a clinical context, HIPAA does, as you noted in the poll, allow for the fairly free sharing of information if the purpose of the sharing is patient care. So if members of the care team if you're under care team's care and they need to share information in order to care for you, then that is sort of within that umbrella. But research is not patient care, as we know. The purpose of research is to obtain generalizable knowledge. So the use of protected health information is a little more restricted under HIPAA for research purposes than for purely clinical purposes. So doctors who are discussing a patient case, they can discuss that patient case if it's for clinical care. Doctors who say, well, I want to look into the electronic health record to see trends in whether this procedure has had good outcomes or not, in general, like across the board. That's not for an individual patient's care. That could be a chart review for research purposes. That could be, part of activities preparing for a research project. So it is a little more restricted. You need to get either patient consent for that research use of protected health information, which in HIPAA terms, that's actually called authorization, but it's very similar to research consent. Or the IRB has to approve a waiver. So if you want to look at like the past 10 years worth of records, you're not going to track down 5,000 patients and ask their permission to see records. Instead, the IRB says, okay, this is minimal risk. You're only looking at certain amounts of information. Give us your plan for protecting that information. Make sure we're minimizing the risk of confidentiality. Then you can look at those records without having to get 5,000 patient authorizations, so that the progress of medical learning is not slowed by doing that. But basically, you either need patient authorization to do research with protected health information, or you need the IRB's approval for a waiver of that document. So it is a little more confined in the research aspect than in clinical use.
Good. All right, so now we want to hear from you guys. We have a case study here. Recall that one of the areas of interest for you all, I've been in several of your previous meetings, so I got the benefit of hearing what really interests you. And one of your topics of interest is the treatment options for mental health in the PhD community. Suppose we wanted to recruit research participants who were newly diagnosed with PhD. Think about our consent and our ethical principles. What are some of the potential issues or harm with recruiting newly diagnosed participants? Anyone willing to share?
Because they're so fresh or newly coming about to the congenital heart disease, they may not be very willing because they haven't been going through it very long to know exactly what they want to say or how they want to say it.
Right. Remember yourself when you were, or your loved one when they're newly diagnosed. It is overwhelming. It is scary. And you are in a mode of information overload. You probably are having challenges processing the information. You're going to be vulnerable. You're going to be vulnerable either to participate in something or to just absolutely not participate in it. It's not good timing. You want the person to be in a position to hear the information being given. And if they've just recently been diagnosed, they're not in a position to hear much of anything, or at least not process it in the way we really want to.
Ethically, at that point, I think they just need support and not to be recruited into anything. I mean, that's what I needed.
Exactly.
And I think at that point too, you're kind of telling them you're going to have mental health issues. Like, okay, this is a given, you know.
Yeah. So now you're going to scare them because they're going to be thinking, well, what does this even mean? You just gave me my diagnosis and now you're telling me I'm going to have depression and anxiety. You're going to go to the worst. We all go to the worst case scenario when we're overwhelmed with anything. It's just our,
Because I think it's not a moment to give, but it's a moment to receive.
exactly.
You're not in a moment to give away, so just you need to get to
And
receive.
you need to be there with your support network. You need to be just trying to sort, and you cannot sort in that moment. So it's not a good time. The timing isn't right. And also I just worry about the fact that they might be skewed, either skewed to participate or not to participate because of the timing. You want to be able to get them in a good position. And this is not the right time for it. All right, true or false? We should never do research involving vulnerable populations. And by vulnerable, we mean patients that typically need some sort of additional protection, or that we should be focused on them for a society point of view. So examples are pregnant women and incarcerated individuals.
You mean never ever do it?
I mean, never, ever. Should we never, ever do research on them? All right, tell me a little bit more, but it is false. Can anyone tell me a little bit more about your thought process? What are some benefits in doing research every now and then on vulnerable populations?
We get to look into more of it and get more of a detail of what other possibilities there are.
Yeah, exactly. Anyone else?
There's no reason why they should be excluded because, again, they're part of the population. So whether they're incarcerated or pregnant, if they have congenital heart, CHF, they're still part of it. So they still should be included.
Very good. If we don't include them, then we're taking out a patient population whose perspectives and whose outcomes might be really important from a research perspective. There's some research, there's actually a lot of research in the cancer setting too. For the longest time, we were really scared about involving patients with terminal cancers in research. MD Anderson, right next door, struggled with this. We were nervous because we wanted to protect them. They're at the end stage of their life. We didn't want to involve them in research. And by golly, they were so upset and advocated, saying, we can protect ourselves here. You're being very paternalistic or fatherly. You're being too restrictive by saying we can't participate in this project. And maybe we could really benefit from that trial. Maybe we can't benefit from that trial, but maybe because we're at the end of our life, we want to be able to contribute to society in some way. That's our choice. By taking it away from us, by overly protecting us, you are hurting our autonomy. Getting back to the respect to persons, you're taking away our own rights, our own individual privilege. New case study. Jacob, feel free to chime in at any time. We have.
Sure.
Did you have something you wanted to add?
I was just going to present this case just because I've done some research.
Oh yeah, great. Thank you.
So in this version of the case study, so recall our topic of interest is the treatment options for mental health in the congenital heart disease community. Suppose we're recruiting college students with congenital heart disease who have anxiety and depression. We want them to participate in 3 focus groups, only 1 hour each, so not very burdensome. but we'll pay them $150 for each hour they participate to ensure good recruitment. So thinking about the consent process and ethical principles we've talked about, what are some potential issues with recruiting college students for money? Anyone can chime in here.
They're basically going to do it because they're college students and they may need the cash. So it may not necessarily be an honest answer that they may be giving or full on participation that they're going to give you that's honest because of the money.
Yeah, and money's not a bad thing.
Exactly.
You want to respect people's time, but $150 in college, I made about $8 now. I mean, you want to be sensitive to context here. That's a bit hefty. So that's good. What are also some potential issues with recruiting participants with anxiety and depression?
Hold on, before we get to that, I thought I heard another voice that wanted to chime
Oh,
in.
sure.
Point. Was there another voice we heard?
I think time is a factor there too. Most college students are busy taking classes
Exactly.
day and night, and so they may rush through
Mm-hmm.
some of the activities.
Very good.
So yeah, what are some issues with recruiting people with anxiety and depression?
There's a possibility that you can create more stress, more anxiety on them just to make sure they do it right for you.
Mm-hmm.
Other thing is you won't be able to determine if the anxiety, depression is coming from the fact that that it's coming from actually the diagnosis, or if that's inherent to that participant.
Mm-hmm. Can't tease out where the depression is coming from. It's from the study itself, or whether it's from the course of their illness. Very good.
You won't know where the answer is coming from, if it's from their own anxiety or if it's really what they think.
Yeah, so study design will have to be very important there. And as you mentioned, maybe it's a pre-existing condition, so you might have to look into some of the medical history, and that's getting into more of their data and records, sensitive data and records. So you want to definitely be careful about how you're treating that data. And is it a self-diagnosis? What are you using for the diagnosis? Are you looking at medical records? Are you using a questionnaire that's validated? Or are they just self-reporting? Yeah, there are validated questionnaires, but another question is, have you gotten their consent to have this questionnaire? What happens if they fill out the questionnaire and it points to severe anxiety and depression? Do you have a way of referring them to the help that they need? Because a lot of things can come up in the course of a research study of, oh, this person needs clinical attention. We're not equipped to do that. Have we streamlined a way to get them to where they need to be? That's a common consideration, especially in mental health studies. So a follow-up question, does that mean we shouldn't recruit anyone with mental health issues?
No, you should, because again, you should still be able to recruit people who are having these issues. That's the purpose of this, is to find out how we can better help.
Yeah, you can't help who you don't study. That's why the answer is never as simple as just exclude them.
Yeah, I think it's important to create the questionnaire very intelligently, because if you have verbose questions, then you may get wayward answers. But if they're more like true, false, or multiple choice, then I think you will get a little more specific answers to what you're actually trying to drive at. I think that's what I think. So the way you design your questionnaire and whatever you're trying to find has to be very intelligently prepared, especially if they have mental issues themselves.
To that point, can I ask a follow-up question? What do you think is the best way for us to make sure it's intelligently designed? Does anyone have any suggestions?
Sorry, what was the question again?
I was just jumping off of the point that we heard someone on the line make, which was you really need to make sure that consent is very intelligently designed. So what can we do as investigators? Put yourselves in our shoes. If we're investigators, what can we do to make sure that that consent and the study itself is designed in a very fair manner and intelligently designed? What are some techniques we can use?
You could try it out on people that aren't actually going to be in the study.
Very
so
good.
that they can understand it, know what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think that's one way to do it. Yeah, absolutely.
And again, like a lot of us that are congenital heart CHF patients ourselves, our input probably can be put into the documents for better understanding for what the people need to understand.
Very good.
To have more than one control.
Exactly. You got to bring it to bring it to a diverse group of people, and you have to bring it to a diverse group of people that is the audience of participants that you're trying to target. If you tell me, I think any of you tell me that is not going to be understandable for someone living in our situation, I'm probably going to come back and say that how can we say it differently? And you're probably going to pick something that's much easier to say, much more readable, and much more common language, and far more likely to be comfortable, to make people comfortable. I really am of the opinion that you can't do any project in patient experience unless you actually involve the patients and their families. So, and Jacob holds the same philosophy in research, which is you can't bring a research project to people unless it really involves the stakeholders at the table. That's what PCORI is trying to fix. PCORI is targeted to do just that, which is bring you all to the table to help, because you have better judgment than we do, honestly, in how the projects go and how they should be designed. I didn't mean to steal your thunder there, Jacob. You can come in with the last point. Sorry.
No, that's right on point there. And not just for the consent document either. The consent, we've been talking a little about the document, but it is a conversation too. It's a process. We said, give people time to understand what the research is about. So you can also help inform how we do that process, how we approach people, when, where we approach people, like we were talking about before. Probably not during the initial diagnosis. What would be the best avenues or media to try to engage people. Because it's not just the document. People don't read documents. You need to have the document there, but you also need to have the conversation with the document. Because legally we have to include probably more detail than what people like to read. That HIPAA paragraph, that is a static legal paragraph. We can't change that. It's got to be written the way it's written. But that doesn't mean the conversation can't be a little more approachable.
Absolutely. And that's a really good point. Informed consent is very much a dialogue. The documentation is just memorializing or documenting that the conversation took place. We still, though, want to give them time to review the document, even if the document is really just a signal that the conversation took place. They should still be able to read it, and you want it to be in a language that's going to be comfortable and understandable to them. Some things we honestly can't. There's a lot of legal elements we can't do much about. A lot of privacy protections are pretty regulatory. So lawyers, I can say this because I am a lawyer, lawyers aren't always the best in drafting language that's understandable. And then they don't let anybody touch it. There's a lot of that, but we really try on our side, on the research side, to get it right. You want me to shift gears, Jacob? You ready? Or
yeah, I think so.
We have I think it's one more poll question. And I will switch back to here. I think we already spoke to this a little bit, but we would be interested in hearing your perspective. What are some benefits in having individuals? So some of you said, well, it's them that we're targeting, but can you think of any other reasons why we might want to have those with mental health issues participate in the project? There's a couple other reasons that we haven't heard come up to be interested in seeing. Equality, very good. Different perspective, better outcomes. Wow, guys. How to help with anxiety? Yeah, I mean, you honestly could benefit from it. If you have mental health and you participate in the project, you might actually learn some strategies or tips on how to make it better, or you might hear about at least some effective treatments for sure. You can hear the perspective from others. Usually in research, there's some sort of focus group component. So you can hear from others. That's often very therapeutic. Then to talk to others who we've all been on forums and groups where we're just wanting to hear from other people who struggle with the same issues, and it can be very helpful to know you're not alone. So there is actually some benefit those with mental health participating in research. And the only way to understand how mental health impacts people to work with them, including studying how it impacts their lifestyle. So absolutely. Very good. You can also identify, I like this point that somebody brought in, which was you can even identify some resources for them. Pretty good chance you'll be able to identify resources for them, just because those who participate, those who lead research projects, we'd like to think we've got at least a pretty good feel on what's happening in the community, and we may be able to help point somebody in the right direction. And many of us, getting down to the point in pink here at the bottom where it says benefit others, many of us derive a lot of joy and happiness when we can help others. So we can even improve our own mental health when we help others. So when we're participating in research and knowing it can benefit the community from a research perspective, from a larger, broader population, we might actually benefit as individuals. Sometimes when you're working on research, you can actually benefit individuals specifically. So that's really the end. We hope you were able to feel included and engaged and learned a lot about research. Do you have any questions for us? I'm trying to be mindful of time. I know, Jacob, were you wanting to show them a consent form? We've got a few minutes left. Or was it a research protocol we were at IRB?
Yeah, I think we nixed that idea because it was a little too far into the weeds. But we also want to leave the 5 minutes, like Dr. Ibarra had said.
Okay.
I had a question about the Henrietta Lacks. I read the book. I can't remember did anything good come from the fact that they made, other people made all the money off of the research? Were there changes because of that? I can't remember.
Yeah, to be honest, so what I remember, and it's been a while since I've studied it, so feel free, Jacob, or really anyone who remembers more about her case, but I know they tried at least 2 or 3 legal cases after hers, and the court still came out the same way, and that once you give the cells up, it's kind of no longer your property. Okay. But they still, so they kind of stripped her of her rights, unfortunately. But they still tried to find a compensation mechanism by indirectly after she died. Unfortunately, she passed at a very young age, trying to support her family financially and kind of a way of honoring her. So it didn't work out for her favorably from a legal standpoint. Jacob, do you remember any more? I remember she died at a really early age, and a lot of work has come from that cell line. A lot of really great work in cancer and AIDS and polio, as I mentioned, and probably some others.
And COVID-19, actually.
And COVID-19,
as recent as
right.
that, yeah. I mean, the issue of data and specimen ownership is still really thorny. I know one of the other things that came out of it, though, was a heightened sensitivity to issue of family privacy, because her genetic code was published. That's not just about her, that's about the family members. That's information about family members indirectly shared without their consent. And so there was a lot more frameworking and discussion in ethics circles about, it's not just the subject you consent when it involves genetic research. It's also anyone they may be related to, really. You have to be sensitive to how you're sharing that data. So that did spark a little conversation in that area.
And to be honest with you, we have not solved it. There's a whole body of genetic ethics research that's still very thorny and still raises a lot of questions. And even Ancestry.com, if any of your family members have uploaded anything to Ancestry.com, pretty good chance we can work your family tree backwards just by using that. So there's a lot with privacy and genetics that we haven't solved.
Well, we want to thank you for a very informative and very interesting meeting tonight. I found it very interesting myself. I'm sure all of us did. Next month, we're going to be covering module number 4, and you'll be getting an email with the information that you'll need and what expectations there are for that module. And remember, please, to provide feedback on the survey that you'll be getting from this meeting. So,
was there another question?
Everybody made it. What's that?
Was there another question? I thought I saw another hand up. Anybody else? Thanks, guys, for being so
thank you very much.
Yeah, really a lot of rich
Thank you.
discussion. So it was our privilege to be able to facilitate conversation with you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Good
you.
night, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.